What was Hobbes' idea of the social contract?
The social contract was Hobbes' solution to the unpleasantness of life in the state of nature. It was an agreement among citizens to give up their individual powers to harm one another and transfer all of those powers to the sovereign, or Leviathan. In return, the sovereign would keep order, which would enable all the benefits of civilized life, such as a just legal system, education, marriage, security in property, and a flourishing of the arts and sciences. Hobbes' Leviathan, though, was to have totalitarian powers over his subjects, including the right over their lives, censorship, the right to draft them into military service, and to impose any other necessary burden of government. The only rights retained by subjects were the rights to preserve themselves and resist imprisonment or execution. Laws were literally the commands of the sovereign. Once the sovereign was made the irrevocable gift of power from the people, the only thing that could bring down the government would be its self-abdication or defeat by foreign enemies.
Who was René Descartes?
René Descartes, 1596–1650, inaugurated modern philosophy with a pair of questions that persist to this day. How are mind and matter different? And how is the mind connected to the body? He did not set out to invent these questions, but encountered them himself while on the way toward trying to do something else. He was trying to prove to the Catholic Church that rigorous philosophy was compatible with religion and that science could be both certain and compatible with religion.
How did Mary Estelle's life affect her written work?
Estelle was unmarried and spent much of her adult life in a community of women with similar backgrounds in London. She is famous for having said, "The whole world is a single ladies' family." But she never openly condemned the subordination of women in marriage because she herself believed in charitable service and the unselfish roles of women in family life. Her main objection to the nature of marriage at her time was that men chose wives mainly for material gain or temporary sexual passion. She wanted husbands and wives to have a bond of friendship.
How did René Descartes' philosophical work begin?
On November 10, 1619, Descartes spent many hours sequestered in a room-sized stove in a town in southern Germany. Such very large stoves with shelves, places to sleep, and room to stand up in them were built in Germany and Russia, until the end of the 19th century. Descartes had an epiphany as the result of three bizarre dreams. which set him on a course to create a new system for science and philosophy. His inspiration was that, beginning with a few ideas known to be absolutely true, and careful methods of reasoning with them, the basic principles of all of the sciences could be logically derived from those ideas. Descartes would go on to live briefly in Paris in 1628, before moving to Holland, where he was to remain for the rest of his life.
Who were the main early modern philosophers?
The customary division is between the rationalists and the empiricists. René Descartes, 1596–1650, Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, and Nicolas Malebranche, 1638–1715, are usually listed as the epistemological rationalists. Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and John Locke, 1632–1704, as the empiricists. However, for a more complete picture, Francisco Suarez, 1548–1617, should be counted among the rationalists, and Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645, among the empiricists.
How did Locke use natural law to construct a theory of government?
In the first treatise on government, 1689, Locke argued against English political theorist Robert Filmer, who claimed that kings, in a direct descent from Adam, had divine rights. Locke pointed out that it was impossible to trace such a direct descent with any accuracy, that human beings had female as well as male parents, and that political power was fundamentally different from patriarchal power. In the second treatise on government, 1689, he identified natural law as God's laws for man, which included the command that man labor for his living. God had given the earth and everything on it to all mankind. Locke therefore asked how it came to be that there was private property, which was necessary to make use of the fruits of the earth. His answer was that whatever an individual mixes his labor with, he comes to own. Locke used the term mixes labor with for labor, in cases where we today would say works on. Locke went on to claim that, in the state of nature, there were two provisos against accumulation through labor: that there be as much and as good left over, and that there be no waste. The first proviso assumed that natural resources would never run out. The second allowed for the store of unused items in precious objects that could be used as money, thereby allowing surplus production to be stored as wealth without the original producer being wasteful. In Locke's state of nature there was industry, cooperation, and trade. Human beings were basically peaceful, except for a few criminals. To assure justice in punishment, government was necessary. But it was merely a convenience added to a generally functional and satisfying situation.
What was Hobbes' belief about free will?
In his The Questions Concerning Liberty, Necessity, and Chance. 1656, Hobbes called his position on free will necessitarianism. He said there was nothing in the human mind to which the word will refers. In other words, there was no will. But there is desire. And what we call will is the last desire before we make up our minds to do something. The entire person can be free, however. Human freedom, according to Hobbes, consists in not being prevented from doing what one desires to do. Freedom, in his view, is thus nothing more or less than liberty. Hobbes also believed that all actions have causes or are necessitated. But we are responsible legally for what we do because it is. Just that we be punished for our decision or will in the matter. The purpose of such punishment is to deter others from misbehaving and preserve justice.
What was Mary Estelle's contribution to early modern philosophy?
Mary Estelle, 1666–1731, used Descartes' ideas to criticize custom, insisting that tradition itself is not a sufficient justification for the subordinate position of married women. She wrote, that the custom of the world, has put women, generally speaking, into a state of subjection, is not denied, but the right can no more be proved from the fact. Then the predominancy of vice can justify it. This willingness to criticize custom in the service of an unpopular claim was an important intellectual innovation. Estelle was interested in the use of reason as an innate capacity of women. She argued that women could find their own religious salvation, intellectually as well as morally. The target of her argument was the prevailing practice of not offering women the same education as men. In her A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, 1694, she proposed a college for upper class women that would prepare them for intellectual activities and religious services. Her claim was that the faults attributed to women could be corrected through education.
What was Hobbes' theory of government in Leviathan?
Hobbes advocated a strong form of monarchy as a way of redescribing the role of the individual in his own politically volatile society. He began with the idea of a state of nature, which was a condition of life without government. Hobbes' method was to determine the uses and justification for government. From that original condition, together with an understanding of human nature. According to Hobbes, human beings in their natural condition are each roughly equal in physical strength. Because the weakest has the ability to kill the strongest. They are not sociable by nature, but rather exist in a prolonged condition in which each individual is against everyone else, a condition of war. In fact, humans only seek one another out for their own glory, greed, or to gang up and conspire against third parties. Without government and the stable organizations and institutions created and supported by government, life in a state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Men do have right reason in nature, the first principle of which is to preserve themselves. They are also aware of the laws of nature, the first of which is to do whatever is possible to keep the peace. But to keep the peace, there needs to be an enforceable contract between parties. And after one side has performed, there is no guarantee that the other will do his or her part. Hobbes wrote that covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all.
Did women object to this negative view of them in the 17th century?
It is difficult to see how they had much opportunity to object. Before and after Oliver Cromwell's rise to power in England, public entertainment and behavior were often bawdy. By the time King William III ascended the throne in 1688, Puritanism dominated public morals, especially among the middle class. For some women, such as the successful playwright Aphra Behn, this was not good news. She wrote, "Though I the wondrous change deplore / that makes me useful and forlorn." But even during the wild times of the Tory Restoration, when sexuality was freely discussed and written about, and sexual relationships and desires were acknowledged as natural and tolerated in respectable society, Behn's explicit poetry and plays had rarely gone beyond the conventional wisdom that women were the dangerous sex. In her poem The Disappointment, she relates Lysander's impotence when he is in the presence of the extremely desirable Chloris. Chloris flees, blushing with disdain and shame, and Lysander curses the shepherdess charm / whose soft betwitching influence / had damned him to the hell of impotence.
What was Thomas Hobbes' life like?
Hobbes' father was the vicar of Westport, but he had to leave for London after his involvement in a brawl outside his church. Thomas's uncle, the alderman of Malmesbury, financed his education. Hobbes studied Greek and Latin at Oxford University from 1602 to 1608, and after graduating he took the position of tutor to Lord Cavendish's oldest son, William. Lord Cavendish, Earl of Devonshire, was to become Hobbes' main patron throughout his working career. With William, he travelled to Europe in 1610, when Johannes Kepler first published his system of the elliptical shape of planetary orbits, and Galileo Galilei was reporting his observations with telescopes. Hobbes met English statesman, scientist, and philosopher Francis Bacon after he returned to England and agreed with him about the need to discard Aristotelian views of science. However, Hobbes did not subscribe to Bacon's inductive method. Bacon believed that scientific knowledge could be built up from observation. Hobbes, in contrast, was to develop a system of knowledge beginning from the first principles of matter and motion from which the nature of experience could be deduced. Hobbes then began reading the classics and translated Thucydides' history into English in 1628. By this time, Sir Cavendish had died and his widow dismissed Hobbes to cut expenses. So, Hobbes went back to Europe to work for another noble family as tutor to Sir Clinton's son. He became interested in geometry as a method for conveying a philosophical system. His interest in astronomy was piqued when he met the astronomer, priest, and philosopher Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, as well as Galileo. From that exchange, he conceived the idea of applying the principles of the science to the human world, specifically to politics and history. He wrote little treatise, 1637, an explanation of sensation set out in a geometrical form, which was both an attack on Aristotle's theory, and his own original thought. He thought that the cause of all sensation was changes in motion of insensible particles. In 1650, Hobbes published his Elements of Law in 2 parts. The psychological treatise Human Nature and De Corpore Politico, which defended unified government. This began a period when Hobbes' life was in danger as politics shifted. Because he was suspected of atheism on account of his materialism and was disliked because of his own dislike of Catholics. Overall, his defense of a strong monarchy set Parliament against him. Meanwhile, he was briefly the mathematical tutor to Charles II. Before he became king, and he published his magnum opus, Leviathan, 1651. Between 1645 and 1663, Hobbes became involved in several protracted and bitter controversies with other thinkers. He disputed the question of free will with John Bramwell, Bishop of Derry. 2 Oxford dons were angry with him. John Wallis, a professor of geometry, was scathing about Hobbes' attempts to square the circle. This was the problem dating from antiquity of devising a method for constructing a square with an area equal to the area of any given circle. Seth Ward, professor of astronomy, was opposed to Hobbes' entire philosophy. Hobbes played tennis until he was 75, rewrote his autobiography in Latin verse at the age of 84. And at 86 published translations of the Iliad and Odyssey in verse.
What was Hobbes' solution to Descartes' mind-body problem?
Hobbes could not make sense of René Descartes' 1596–1650 idea of a thinking substance. He first criticized Descartes for confusing the thing that thinks with the action of thinking. And then, concerning the thing that thinks, Hobbes wrote that a thinking thing is something corporeal. This is because it seems that the subjects of all actions are comprehensible only if they are conceived as corporeal or material. What this amounted to in the history of metaphysics was that Hobbes solved the mind-body problem by denying that there existed a non-material substance of mind, because everything that existed had to be material.
How did Hobbes explain sensation, memory, imagination, thought, and emotion?
Hobbes described sensations as effects of movement in the body that are felt through the motions of the heart. Sense always has some memory adhering to it. Because sense organs retain the movements of external bodies acting on them. So long as the organs are moved by one object, they cannot be moved by another. Imagination is decaying sense, after the source of sensation is removed. And memory is similar to imagination, except that it also has a feeling of familiarity. Hobbes believed that thought involved literal movements in the head. His idea of unguided thought led to later theories of the association of ideas. That one thought automatically evokes another in the mind. Guided thought is goal-directed. Hobbes thought that while humans and animals both may perform the action that is necessary to reach a goal, only humans have the distinctive trait of prudence. Prudence involves beginning with the action that one can perform, and then calculating its consequences as a guide for what to do. Prudence increases with experience. Concerning the passions, or emotions, which he called endeavors, Hobbes postulated two types of motion in the body: vital motions, such as breathing, nutrition, and the circulation of the blood, and animal motion, such as voluntary movement. Pleasure is nothing more than motion around the heart. Appetite is an endeavor toward an object associated with pleasure, and aversion is an endeavor away from it.
What were the common themes of the Enlightenment?
The common themes were a set of values that included the following. Imbuing all other values was the importance of reason and its uses to discover ideal forms of human nature and society. The belief in the natural goodness of man, which was to be rediscovered by the reform of corrupt institutions. An overall secularity and downplaying of traditional Christian transcendence. A new aesthetic and ethics based on the goodness of nature. Perhaps most important, a great faith in progress, or the belief that the present is better than the past and that the future will be better than the present. Nevertheless, none of the paramount Enlightenment thinkers simply played out these themes in direct ways. They almost all used reason or rational thought together, with a fair amount of wit to propound and develop their ideas. The ideas themselves, though, sometimes had unforeseen consequences. That is, often the Enlightenment geniuses went too far, or were not able to fully think things through. As a result, skepticism, pessimism, and romantic madness took over when the ideas of progress and the ideals of human reason ran out.
What were the general ideas about women that were held by people in the 17th century?
The old Aristotelian idea that females were imperfect males was still assumed to be true in 17th century Europe. The modern science of biology, which established two distinct sexes, was still in the future. Although 18th and 19th century sexual distinctions based on biology supported the idea that the capabilities of women were inherently limited and inferior to those of men, they at least focused on the distinctness of male and female identities. The Aristotelian view has been called the one-sex theory. Many serious and well-regarded theorists of the human body solemnly insisted that the female reproductive system was no more than an inverted form of the male one. Like Aristotle, they believed that women were naturally colder and damper than men, besides being in every respect weaker. Moreover, women were considered to be the sex-desiring, aggressive gender, whereas men were often viewed as helpless and vulnerable in sexual matters. Medical opinion concurred that blood, semen, and spinal fluid were all the same basic vital substance or fluid, albeit in different forms. Sexual intercourse was not only often viewed as a weakening form of physical dissipation, but male ejaculation was believed to draw brain tissue down the spine and out the penis, a very strong reason for a male philosopher to remain celibate. Moreover, women were viewed as the source of venereal disease, unwanted children, and burdensome financial obligations. So great was their negative sexual power held to be that they were at the same time also presumed responsible for male impotence.
How did Robert Burton apply scientific methods to his own mind?
Robert Burton, 1577 to 1640, spent most of his life at Oxford University, where he was vicar of St. Thomas Church. He was later appointed rector of Segrave, Leicester. He was a mathematician with interests in astrology and was known to be companionable and cheerful. However, he suffered all his life from a heavy heart and hatchling in my head. A kind of imposthume in my head, which I was very desirous to be unladen of. In the preface to the Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, he explained the work as therapeutic. I write of melancholy, by being busy to avoid melancholy. There is no greater cause of melancholy than idleness, no better cure than business.
What was René Descartes' problem with the Inquisition?
Descartes never had a direct problem with the Inquisition, but he was always afraid of church authorities, and at the same time he wanted their approval. His book on cosmology and physics, which was in accord with both atomism and Copernicanism, was ready to publish, when he withdrew it after he heard of the Inquisition's condemnation of Galileo. In 1637, Descartes published his Optics, Meteorology, and Geometry that was prefaced with Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and reaching the truth in the sciences, 1637. Here, Descartes developed his doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. An idea was clear if one could be sure about what the idea was, and distinct, if it was different from other ideas. He next published his Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641. Partly in response to criticism he had received on the Discourse on Method, 1637. The Discourse explained Descartes' new way of deriving the first principles of the sciences from a few clear and distinct ideas. The Meditations was published with a set of objections and replies from his contemporaries, including Marin Mersenne, 1588–1648, Thomas Hobbes 1588–1679, and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. And it went to a second edition in 1642. It was a completely original work in its claims that it was possible to be certain about the nature of physical reality and the existence of God based on certainty about one's own existence. Descartes' pre-publication discussions led to refinements in his position that related his ideas to the intellectual concerns of his peers. From these discussions, the Meditations became one of the most famous philosophical works. Philosophers still obsess about it in the 21st century. Descartes became increasingly concerned about intellectual attacks on him by papal authorities. His friends thought that he exaggerated the personal and professional dangers of these attacks. But Descartes' own ambition was tied up with his response to them. His thinking went to the heart of the Catholic Church's use of skepticism to deny the findings of the new science that contradicted church doctrine and scripture. It was Descartes' hope that the Jesuits would approve his ideas in the Meditations and even use it as a textbook. Descartes' next publication was Principles of Philosophy, 1644, which he believed would be a masterpiece that would gain the Church's approval.
Who was Francisco Suarez?
Francisco Suarez, also called Dr. Eximius, 1548–1617, was a Spanish Jesuit theological philosopher. He taught mainly in Spain and Italy, at Salamanca, Rome, and Coimbra. He wrote on Law, 1612, on the Trinity, 1606, and on the Soul, 1612. His best-known work was his 54 Arguments, or treatises, known as Metaphysical Disputations. 1597, which were believed to have influenced Descartes, Leibniz, and Grotius in the 17th century, and Schopenhauer in the 19th. Suarez treated metaphysics in the first extended systematic way in the European tradition after Aristotle, which was not an Aristotelian commentary.
What stories did Hobbes' contemporaries tell about him?
According to the biography of Hobbes written by his contemporary John Aubrey, when Hobbes was at Oxford, he used to get up early in the morning and venture forth with lead weights, pack threads, and parings of cheese. He would smear the threads with birdlime, an adhesive substance used to trap birds by sticking their feet to something, and bait them with the cheese. Jackdaws would spy them from far away and strike at the bait. Young Hobbes would then haul in the string and the weights would cling to the bird's wings. Aubrey does not furnish details about what happened after that. After the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666, people sought reasons for God's wrath. Parliament passed a bill to suppress atheism, and a committee was constituted to investigate Hobbes' Leviathan. There was a report that Hobbes had been burned in effigy, and Hobbes was afraid that his papers would be searched, so he himself burned part of them. The king, who liked Hobbes, intervened, but from then on Hobbes was not permitted to publish his work. Neither the Roman Catholic Church nor Oxford University permitted his books to be read, and they occasionally even burned them.
Would marriage have changed the emotional lives of 17th-century philosophers?
The answer is not clear. In the 17th century, primogeniture, or leaving the entire inheritance of a father to his oldest son, was the norm. About 1/4 of younger sons in the middle classes did not marry because they could not afford to set up households or find brides with substantial dowries. Child mortality was between 30 and 50% of all live births. And after 20 years of marriage it was highly unlikely that both spouses would still be alive. These statistics rendered family relationships more dependent on roles than on individual emotional attachments based on distinct personalities. During the early modern period, people did not marry for what we consider to be romantic reasons. None of this is to say that there were not strong lifelong friendships between men and women. Philosophers such as René Descartes, John Locke, and Gottfried Leibniz had long-term female correspondence. But it is doubtful that they knew what we would call love.
What was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment was known to its contemporaries and future generations as the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment went beyond intellectual activity to affect painting, literature, architecture, religion, the sciences, and, of course, politics. culminating in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, and the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. While there were common Enlightenment intellectual themes, conditions in different nations produced distinctive types of thought. Also, there was a marked development of ideas from the first half of the 1700s to the second half, principally because of the major social and political changes preceding and accompanying the American and French revolutions.
What happened to Locke during his life and what were some of his important publications?
John Locke was born in Rington, Somerset, England. His father was an attorney and justice of the peace who fought on the parliamentary side against Charles I. At Westminster School, which Locke began attending in 1646, he learned the classics, Hebrew and Arabic. From Westminster, he went to Oxford University, where he disagreed with the scholastic philosophy that was taught. After he achieved his master's degree, he lectured in Latin and Greek. And in 1664 he was given the position of censor of moral philosophy. When his father died in 1661, Locke inherited enough money to be financially independent. He soon met such famed scientists as Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and renowned physician Thomas Sydenham, who inspired Locke to train as a medical doctor. Locke never practiced medicine but was considered knowledgeable in this area all his life. In 1666, Locke met Lord Ashley, Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury suffered from an infected cyst on his liver, and Locke oversaw his surgery, including the insertion of a silver tube to drain the wound. The Earl's gratitude after recovery resulted in a long-term patronage. Shaftesbury supported Locke's philosophical endeavors and his nomination to the Royal Society. In 1668, conversations with colleagues Locke met through that connection resulted in the early drafts of his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1689. Locke also served Shaftesbury in practical political ways that resulted in some of his most important contributions. He drafted a constitution for British colonial Carolina, and was secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations. Shaftesbury was tried for treason due to his leadership of the parliamentary opposition to the Stuarts. He was acquitted, but left England for Holland. Locke also left, and while he was in Holland, his position at Oxford was taken away by the king. Then James II denounced him as a traitor after the Duke of Monmouth's failed rebellion. Locke continued to write, working on an essay concerning human understanding. 1689, and his first letter concerning toleration, 1689. He also became involved with the plan to put the Protestants William and Mary on the English throne. Locke advised William, and after the glorious rebellion of 1688, he escorted Mary, Princess of Orange, on her ship back to England. In 1689 and 1690, Locke's two major works, an essay concerning human understanding and two treatises of civil government, were completed. Always suffering from poor health, Locke then retired from his active involvements in politics. Still, he went on to write some thoughts concerning education, 1693, and the reasonableness of Christianity. 1695, followed by a vindication of the reasonableness of Christianity, 1695. This last work sparked a controversy between Locke and Edward Stillingfleet, Bishop of Worcester. Locke's denial of evidence for substance was taken by Stillingfleet to be a denial of the Anglican Church's doctrine of the Trinity, as well as a barrier to life after death through the immortality of the soul.
What was an essay in defense of the female sex?
In an essay in defense of the female sex, the usurpation of man, and the tyranny of custom. Here in England, especially, 1696, marriage was directly attacked. John Locke's, 1632–1704, empiricist epistemology was put to use. In a search for social causes of the inequality between the sexes. The writer did not argue that women were as good as men, claiming that they were actually better on account of their intellectual superiority, which resulted from differences in nature.
What was Francisco Suárez's view of metaphysics?
Suárez defined metaphysics as the study of being insofar as it is real being. The idea of being was analogous to the similarities among things that existed. Suárez held that everything which exists is an individual, not capable of further division into individuals like it. Suárez's focus on the most general kinds of things that exist was echoed in Descartes' division of the world into mind and matter.
What is early modern philosophy?
Early modern philosophy is mainly centered on intellectual activity in the 17th century, with some overlap into the early 18th and late 16th centuries. Early modern philosophy was modern in its concerns with epistemology, or the nature and justification of human knowledge. The fact that the scientific revolution was by then taken for granted, and a new acceptance of logical argument and fact-based reasons as necessary ingredients for the practice of philosophy. However, what made it early modern was the continued importance of religious issues. The background social need for philosophers to assert a belief in God, the continued reaction against Aristotelian scholasticism, and the unstable political context prior to the existence of strong nation-states.
What was Enlightenment philosophy?
Enlightenment philosophy was written during the time associated with the Enlightenment, which occurred roughly around the 18th century. The Enlightenment was an historical period in which the ideas of philosophers played dominant cultural roles. In contrast to the importance of religion during the medieval period, or the importance of science and technology in the 19th and 20th centuries.
What was René Descartes like as a person?
It is difficult to say. In contemporary terms, Descartes would probably be considered a fearful, anxious, and self-absorbed man with social disorders. He was the only 17th-century philosopher who never had a patron or a secure post. And he was not independently wealthy. Descartes moved to Holland to escape the distractions of Paris, so that he could concentrate on his work. He was secretive about his personal life and moved his household about once a year during a 20-year period. Wherever he was, he conducted experiments, sometimes getting animal organs from local butchers. One account has it that when he studied vision, he literally looked through a calf's eyes. Descartes was greatly interested in special foods and diets, possibly as a way to prolong life or even to achieve immortality. At times he was a vegetarian. It's clear this was not for moral reasons. Given his belief that animals are machines, and other times he thought that the secret lay in eggs. With a servant named Helena Jans, he had an illegitimate daughter, while Descartes' daughter, Francine, is usually described as illegitimate by biographers. Her baptism was recorded in 1635 in the Reformed Church in Deventer. Francine died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever, and Descartes expressed great sorrow for this loss. Descartes' motto was said to have been, "A life well hidden is a life well lived." Another version has it as, "I advance masked."
Did any of the early modern male philosophers consider the position of women in their writing?
Yes. René Descartes, 1596–1650, deliberately wrote his Discourse on Method, 1637, in French. In part so that women, who were not usually taught Latin, would be able to read it. Hobbes considered women to be just as strong and free as men in the original state of nature, and talked about their consent being necessary to enter into marriage. He also referred to the power of women when he called them Lord Mothers, to whom their children were obligated if they had nurtured and raised them, instead of abandoning them to fortune. John Locke, 1632–1704, thought that the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which was based on heredity from Adam, simply left out the existence of female parents. He described marriage as a partnership for the sake of procreation and raising children, and suggested that once children were grown, the husband and wife could go their separate ways if they chose. In his thoughts concerning education, 1693, written in response to his cousin's questions about how young men should be raised. Locke wrote that girls should receive basically the same education as boys.
What was distinctive about Elizabeth Elstob?
Elizabeth Elstob, c. 1683 – 1756, was the first professional scholar to compile an Anglo-Saxon grammar. In her introduction to an English-Saxon homily on the birthday of St. Gregory, 1709, she argued for the usefulness of educating women on the grounds that scholarly work itself was valuable.
Why were the great 17th-century philosophers and scientists bachelors?
They were either relatively poor, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, or prohibited from marrying because they were priests. Fathers Marin Mersenne 1588–1648 and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. Or it was a tradition for men of learning not to have their own families. For example, Oxford dons were not allowed to marry at that time, and the 7 Fellows of Gresham College, founded in 1558, were all bachelors. Another reason might have been the prevailing beliefs about the nature of women. Women were not allowed to be scholars and wives, and family life was not only considered a distraction for men of learning, but sexual relations were believed to be intellectually weakening for scholars.
What is the story of Descartes' life?
René Descartes, 1596–1650, father was a member of the minor nobility. His mother died when he was 13 months old. And after his father remarried, he was raised by his maternal grandmother. At 10 he was sent to the new Jesuit college of La Flèche in Anjou, France, and there studied the classics, history, rhetoric, and Aristotelian natural philosophy. Although he considered La Flèche an excellent school, he thought that the natural philosophy he learned there was doubtful, mainly because it was based on scholastic abstractions that had been outdated by more recent discoveries and thought. Descartes then took a law degree at Poitiers and set off to complete his education by travel in Europe. He wrote that he had resolved to seek no knowledge other than that which could be found either in myself or the great book of the world. He served briefly in the army and then became friends with Isaac Beeckman. 1588–1637, a Dutch philosopher and scientist who inspired him to study mathematics. Descartes' first book, Compendium Musicae, applied mathematics to harmony and dissonance. Descartes also began work on his discovery of analytic geometry that was published in 1637.
What was the reaction to Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy?
Burton wrote The Anatomy of Melancholy under the pseudonym Democritus Jr. His book was well received. Literary historian and critic Thomas Warton, 1728–1790, wrote of it. The author's variety of learning, his quotations from rare and curious books, his pedantry sparkling with rude wit and shapeless elegance have rendered it a repertory of amusement and information. Indeed, Burton's treatise is full of satire, and it constitutes a prodigious display of historical and literary knowledge. However, the genius of Burton's Anatomy lies in its attempt to give a naturalistic account of the mind as both distinct from the body and yet intimately connected with it. Burton's theory of human cognition and consciousness rests on his notion of spirit, through which all of the functions and faculties of mind are physically connected with different parts of the body. While mistaken and overly literal by more modern standards, Burton's general project of investigating mind-body correspondence remains a cornerstone of empirical mind-body and mind-brain scientific research to this day.
What did John Locke mean by saying the mind was a tabula rasa?
Unlike the rationalists, who thought that we were born with certain ideas about the world, Locke thought that our minds are like a blank slate, tabula rasa, at birth. All of our ideas are the result of two different processes that happen after we are born. The first is sensory experience, and the second is our reflection on our sensory experience and on the workings of our own minds. One of his main arguments against innate ideas was that people do not all have the same ideas, but their ideas differ as their experience has differed.
Why was John Locke important?
As a philosopher of knowledge, or epistemologist, John Locke, 1632–1704, sidestepped the metaphysical problems raised by René Descartes, 1596–1650, and offered a theory of the mind and its capabilities that grounded modern ideas of education, psychology, and philosophy of science. Locke's political views about democratic government and individual rights were foundational, not only for the modern British parliamentary system, but also for the basic principles of the U.S. Constitution. His idea of natural law persists in practical political theories to this day.
How and why was Locke's idea of the social contract different from Hobbes'?
Locke held that the social contract was an agreement between citizens or their representatives and the government or king. Because basic amenities of human life and its fundamental social institutions were present before the social contract, government was not as essential in Locke's view, as it had been in Hobbes. Human society existed and functioned well before government. And if government dissolved or if the governed brought it down for just reasons, society would still exist. However, if something destroyed society, that would also destroy the government.
What is epistemological rationalism?
Epistemological rationalism is the position that human beings have important ideas or principles present in their minds from birth, and that the most important truths about the world can be derived from thought, without the need for experience. These a priori truths are also held to be logically certain, which is to say that it would entail a logical contradiction to deny them, and that they are absolutely certain, or, in current terminology, true in all possible worlds.
What was meant by reason during the Enlightenment?
Reason was considered a universal capacity of all people that was brought to fruition by logic and the knowledge of science. It required people to abandon superstition and oppressive institutions, such as absolute monarchy and doctrinaire religion.
What was meant by reason during the Enlightenment?
Reason was considered a universal capacity of all people that was brought to fruition by logic and the knowledge of science. It required people to abandon superstition and oppressive institutions, such as absolute monarchy and doctrinaire religion.
Is there a sharp distinction between Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals?
No, both Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals influenced the ideas of the time. Among philosophers, those who have endured historically as part of the present philosophical canon are limited to George Berkeley, David Hume, Thomas Reid, Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and Guillaume Battista Vico. John Locke is also strongly associated with the Enlightenment, although he dates back to the 17th century. However, during their times, brilliant thought in other fields by writers and personalities such as Ethan Allen, Marquis de Condorcet, Denis Diderot, Jonathan Edwards, Benjamin Franklin, Baron de Holbach, Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Marie de Maistre, Charles Baron du Montesquieu, Thomas Paine, Joseph Priestley, Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, and Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, were part of the intellectual climate for philosophers, as well.
Is there a sharp distinction between Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals?
No, both Enlightenment philosophers and other intellectuals influenced the ideas of the time. Among philosophers, those who have endured historically as part of the present philosophical canon are limited to George Berkeley, David Hume, Thomas Reid, Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and Guillaume Battista Vico. John Locke is also strongly associated with the Enlightenment. Although he dates back to the 17th century. However, during their times, brilliant thought in other fields by writers and personalities such as Ethan Allen, Marquis de Condorcet, Denis Diderot, Jonathan Edwards, Benjamin Franklin, Baron de Holbach, Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Marie de Maistre, Charles Baron du Montesquieu, Thomas Paine, Joseph Priestley, Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, and Voltaire. François-Marie Arouet, were part of the intellectual climate for philosophers, as well.
Were all 18th century thinkers in agreement with Enlightenment themes?
No. As a counter-tradition to the general rational spirit of the Enlightenment were the Romantics, such as the writers Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Friedrich Schiller, and William Wordsworth. There were also those, generally referred to as the pessimists of the Enlightenment, who did not subscribe to the belief in progress characteristic of the age. For example, in philosophy, Guillaume Battista Vico, Edmund Burke, and Joseph Marie de Maistre. And in letters, William Cooper, Coderlos de Laxlos, the Marquis de Sade, and Jonathan Swift.
Were all 18th century thinkers in agreement with Enlightenment themes?
No. As a counter-tradition to the general rational spirit of the Enlightenment were the Romantics, such as the writers Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Friedrich Schiller, and William Wordsworth. There were also those, generally referred to as the pessimists of the Enlightenment, who did not subscribe to the belief in progress characteristic of the age. For example, in philosophy, Guillaume Battista Vico, Edmund Burke, and Joseph Marie de Maistre. And in letters, William Cooper, Coderlos de Laxlos, the Marquis de Sade, and Jonathan Swift.
Who was George Berkeley?
George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, was the founder of modern idealism. Unlike his 17th-century idealist predecessors, such as Nicolas Malebranche, 1638 to 1715, or Gottfried Leibniz, 1647 to 1716, he was not a rationalist. Berkeley was completely comfortable with science and empiricism in general. And he significantly weighs in with the great triumvirate of British empiricists. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Berkeley was born in County Kilkenny in Ireland, where he went to Kilkenny College for 4 years. Beginning at age 11. He then went to Trinity College in Dublin and was elected a Fellow there in 1707, holding the position until 1724. His first book, An Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, was published in 1709, followed by the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge in 1710. In 1713, he moved to London and published 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonas, the first of his works to be well received. He was presented to Queen Anne by the renowned essayist and satirist Jonathan Swift. 1667 to 1745, and became friends with the literary elite of that time. In 1713, Berkeley traveled to Sicily as chaplain to the ambassador. His next position was as a tutor to St. George Ashe, the Bishop of Derry, which involved further travel in Europe. He then wrote De Motu, on motion, in 1721, as well as an essay towards preventing the ruin of Great Britain, in which he argued that a recent financial crisis, the South Sea Island bubble, which was a stock market crash that resulted from over-speculation, was the result of a decline in religion and morals. In 1723 he received a windfall inheritance from Esther van Humrai, an Irish woman of Dutch descent who was a longtime correspondent and lover of Jonathan Swift, who called her Vanessa in his poetry. Berkeley claimed that she was a perfect stranger. In 1724 Berkeley was appointed Dean of Derry, which provided him financial security. But his dream was to found a Christian college in Bermuda that would admit Negroes and Indians, as well as white Americans. He raised money for the project, but not enough for it to become a reality. The British Parliament awarded him £20,000, but that money never came through. Berkeley married in 1728 and he and his wife, Anne, went to Rhode Island to set up farms to grow food for the prospective college. They remained there for 3 years, and then returned to live in London. He defended Christianity in the Minute Philosopher in 1732, and claimed that mathematics was more mysterious than religion in the Analyst in 1734. That same year, he became Bishop of Cloyne, which led him to move back to Ireland, where he remained until he died in 1753, while visiting his son at Oxford University.
Who was George Berkeley?
George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, was the founder of modern idealism. Unlike his 17th-century idealist predecessors, such as Nicholas Malebranche, 1638 to 1715, or Gottfried Leibniz, 1647 to 1716, he was not a rationalist. Berkeley was completely comfortable with science and empiricism in general. And he significantly weighs in with the great triumvirate of British empiricists. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Berkeley was born in County Kilkenny in Ireland, where he went to Kilkenny College for 4 years. Beginning at age 11. He then went to Trinity College in Dublin and was elected a Fellow there in 1707, holding the position until 1724. His first book, An Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, was published in 1709, followed by the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge in 1710. In 1713, he moved to London and published 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonas, the first of his works to be well received. He was presented to Queen Anne by the renowned essayist and satirist Jonathan Swift. 1667 to 1745, and became friends with the literary elite of that time. In 1713, Berkeley traveled to Sicily as chaplain to the ambassador. His next position was as a tutor to St. George Ashe, the Bishop of Derry, which involved further travel in Europe. He then wrote De Motu, on motion, in 1721, as well as an essay towards preventing the ruin of Great Britain, in which he argued that a recent financial crisis, the South Sea Island bubble, which was a stock market crash that resulted from over-speculation, was the result of a decline in religion and morals. In 1723 he received a windfall inheritance from Esther van Humrai, an Irish woman of Dutch descent who was a longtime correspondent and lover of Jonathan Swift, who called her Vanessa in his poetry. Berkeley claimed that she was a perfect stranger. In 1724 Berkeley was appointed Dean of Derry, which provided him financial security. But his dream was to found a Christian college in Bermuda that would admit Negroes and Indians, as well as white Americans. He raised money for the project, but not enough for it to become a reality. The British Parliament awarded him £20,000, but that money never came through. Berkeley married in 1728 and he and his wife, Anne, went to Rhode Island to set up farms to grow food for the prospective college. They remained there for 3 years, and then returned to live in London. He defended Christianity in the Minute Philosopher in 1732, and claimed that mathematics was more mysterious than religion in the Analyst in 1734. That same year, he became Bishop of Cloyne, which led him to move back to Ireland, where he remained until he died in 1753, while visiting his son at Oxford University.
What was George Berkeley's new theory of vision?
Berkeley, like René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, sought to account for the perception of distance. Descartes had claimed in his Dioptrics, 1647, that an innate knowledge of geometry Enables even those who have never studied geometry to calculate distance by figuring out the height of a triangle formed by light rays from the visible object to each eye. Berkeley, built on Irish natural philosopher William Molyneux's 1656–1698, claim that distance as a length from the object to the eye, cannot itself be seen. Berkeley reasoned that since what is seen is a two-dimensional object, its relation to distance is contingent, dependent on sensations in the eyes and associations in the mind between what has been touched and what is seen. These associations depend on past experience. The overall result of Berkeley's reasoning about how vision works is that visual perception is an active, learned process. He also claimed, against John Locke, 1632–1704, that there are no general ideas common to both sight and touch.
What was George Berkeley's new theory of vision?
Berkeley, like René Descartes, 1596–1650, sought to account for the perception of distance. Descartes had claimed in his Dioptrics, 1647, that an innate knowledge of geometry enables even those who have never studied geometry to calculate distance by figuring out the height of a triangle formed by light rays from the visible object to each eye. Berkeley, built on Irish natural philosopher William Molyneux's 1656–1698, claim that distance as a length from the object to the eye, cannot itself be seen. Berkeley reasoned that since what is seen is a two-dimensional object, its relation to distance is contingent, dependent on sensations in the eyes and associations in the mind between what has been touched and what is seen. These associations depend on past experience. The overall result of Berkeley's reasoning about how vision works is that visual perception is an active, learned process. He also claimed, against John Locke, 1632–1704, that there are no general ideas common to both sight and touch.